It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A shift in the room that most people wouldn't have noticed at first glance, but once you saw it, it was impossible to ignore. You could feel it in the air. A subtle tightening in the space between applause and expectation. It was the kind of moment where history doesn't just watch you. It nudges, ever so slightly, and waits to see what you will do next. And in that quiet, tense pause, the 2026 MLK Jr. Beloved Community Awards ceremony became more than an award show. It became something else entirely. Something that would ripple far beyond the polished stage lights and the carefully arranged seating charts. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Have you ever been in a room where everyone is looking, but no one is really seeing? That's exactly what was happening as Meghan Markle took the stage. The crowd knew she was coming, of course. She always commands attention. That isn't news. But this night, this one particular night, it wasn't admiration that preceded her. There was an undercurrent, a tension that hadn't been there before. Something unspoken, yet palpable. And then, as if the room itself had been holding its breath, Billie Eilish stepped forward to deliver her part in the proceedings. And everything changed. Imagine, for a moment, the look on Meghan's face as she prepared to speak. Not the rehearsed, polished expression she usually wears for cameras, but something more human, more immediate. Nervous energy wrapped in composure. Confidence mixed with anticipation. And then, a word. One word from Billie, delivered with a tone that was both casual and cutting. A word that did not belong in a ceremony honoring community, respect, and legacy. Wannabe. Pause there for a second. Let that sink in. A word thrown across a room of hundreds. A word that instantly fractures the polished image, the careful choreography of public appearances. In one syllable, something that had been carefully curated over years was disrupted, unsettled, exposed. And yet, it wasn't shouted. It wasn't screamed into the microphone. It was delivered almost quietly, almost offhand, but it carried a weight that the cameras, polite as they were, couldn't fully capture. But why? Why would Billie, a pop star whose name alone can dominate headlines for weeks, risk such a confrontation? Why target someone like Meghan Markle, whose very life has been documented, dissected, and discussed in ways that make ordinary scrutiny seem trivial? That's what makes this story compelling. That's what makes it matter right now, today, not tomorrow, not in some distant cultural analysis. It is the collision of two worlds. Celebrity culture and royalty, amplified, magnified, exposed on a stage that was supposed to be about celebration, about recognition, about community. And yet, it didn't start there. It never does. Moments like these are never spontaneous. They are built on layers of tension, history, expectation, and personality. To understand what happened that night, to really understand why a single word could reverberate so loudly, we have to go deeper. We have to consider the context. The weeks, the months, even the years of public positioning, of media speculation, of subtle rivalries that most people would never notice. Because this wasn't just about a stage. It was about influence, perception, and control. It was about two very public figures negotiating power in real time, in front of an audience that included journalists, dignitaries, activists, and fans alike. And in those negotiations, the slightest slip, emotional, verbal, or visual, can become a story that defines reputations. Consider this. In the first 10 seconds of that exchange, the world didn't know what to make of it. Meghan froze for a fraction of a second, enough for cameras to catch the hesitation, but too brief for the human eye to process fully. Billie didn't flinch. Her gaze held, measured, precise, and unmistakably deliberate. There's something almost primal in a confrontation like that. One side testing the other weighing every possible response, every repercussion. And while most viewers were waiting for applause, or for the speech to continue, something else was happening. Something invisible, something that would only become clear later. And that's the thing about these moments. They don't exist in isolation. Every facial twitch, every pause, every subtle shift in tone, these are clues. Clues that tell us not just about the individuals involved, but about the pressures, expectations, and networks of influence that surround them. When you start looking closely, you notice the way staff members shifted, The way cameras lingered slightly too long on expressions, the way social media lit up almost immediately, as if the world sensed that something had been disrupted, even before they could articulate what. Here's a question for you. Have you ever seen someone humiliate another in public, and yet felt like you were only seeing the tip of the iceberg? That's what this story is about. Because the wannabe remark, as cutting as it was, is only the surface. Underneath lies a web of preparation, strategy, and reaction. Texts exchanged in the hours before the ceremony. Private conversations with aides and confidants. Choices made in the quiet moments backstage. And yes, the public faces. The staged smiles, the polite applause, the professional nods. These are part of the performance too. But they aren't the full story. Not by a long shot. And while most headlines will scream about confrontation, celebrity clash, or royal embarrassment, the reality is subtler and infinitely more fascinating. Because what was happening that night wasn't just a feud. It was a microcosm of how power, perception, and personality collide on a global stage. It was about influence being tested, reputation being negotiated, and the rules of public engagement being rewritten in real time. And most importantly, it was about the people who were watching, millions online, hundreds in the room, being forced to confront a question they rarely asked themselves. How much of what we see is performance, and how much is truth? By the end of this video, we'll have unpacked every layer. The build-up, the subtle cues, the backstage tension, the public reaction, and the hidden aftershocks that no one saw coming. But for now, we linger in the moment just after Billie's word hit the room, a pause pregnant with implication. Because if the first impression is lasting, then this one will be remembered. The eyes, the expressions, the tiny shifts in posture. They tell stories that words alone cannot. And in this pause, we are left with a question, one that will thread through everything you're about to see. How does one word, delivered so casually, carry the power to destabilize a world meticulously constructed over years? The silence that followed wasn't immediate. It was measured, almost deliberate, as if the room itself had to decide how to respond. 1 second stretched into another. People shifted in their seats, leaning slightly forward, then back, unsure if they'd just witnessed an accident or a statement. A word like that, wannabe, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It hangs. It hovers. And in those first seconds, before the laughter, before the murmurs, there was a tension that felt almost physical. Have you ever watched a room collectively hold its breath? That's exactly what happened. Hundreds of eyes on the stage, cameras trained, journalists ready to scribble, social media buzzing silently in the background. And in that space, two figures dominated everything. Meghan Markle, poised, composed, or at least attempting to be, and Billie Eilish, whose face barely betrayed a flicker of mischief. It wasn't anger. Not really. It wasn't smugness either. It was something closer to a quiet assertion, almost like she was testing boundaries. But here's the strange thing. You could feel the room leaning toward Meghan, almost instinctively. She's practiced, trained, and accustomed to public scrutiny. She knows how to maintain a facade of calm. And yet, anyone who's ever seen her in an unscripted moment knows she's human first. That human edge is what Billie's remarks scraped against, what it exposed. There's a subtle, almost imperceptible intake of breath. A blink that's just a bit too long. A pause before words. And in those microseconds, the audience senses, without knowing exactly why, that something has shifted. Why did it land so hard? Perhaps because it was unexpected. Perhaps because the tension between celebrity and royalty isn't new, but it's rarely this visible, this raw. Meghan is a figure constantly in dialogue with the world, image, media, and public expectation. And Billie, well, she's a disruptor, someone whose career thrives on defying convention and unsettling comfort zones. What happens when those worlds collide on a stage meant for honor and reflection? The answer is complicated and messy, and that mess is exactly what made the night unforgettable. You might be wondering what the crowd actually did. Immediate reactions are always fascinating because they're instinctual. Some stiffened, some laughed quietly, unsure if they should. A few people exchanged glances, perhaps to gauge whether what they thought they heard was actually said. And then there was a pause. A gap long enough for the press photographers to capture expressions that would later fill columns. for social media to ignite with speculation, for whispers to become headlines. Every subtle movement, every breath held or released, became a data point, a clue to human response under unexpected pressure. Meanwhile, Meghan, for her part, maintained composure. Her speech continued, but the rhythm had subtly changed. There was a new weight to her pauses, a recalibration of tone, a careful measurement of emphasis. And all the while, the audience processed multiple layers: the actual words, the delivery, the unspoken context. Emotional contrast is a powerful thing. The stage had been a place of celebration. Now it was a space of judgment and scrutiny. Every smile measured, every nod calculated, and every second stretched longer than anyone anticipated. It's in moments like this that the world outside begins to bleed in. Phones are out. Messages are sent. People tweet in real time. Within minutes, the quiet tension becomes a global conversation. And yet, even as this wave spreads, it remains unclear to the casual observer what the truth really is. Context matters. Tone matters. Intention matters. And the subtleties of a single word, how it's delivered, the pause before, the expression accompanying it, can redefine narratives almost instantly. Let's step behind the curtain for a moment. Because what you see on camera is only half of the story. Backstage, things were very different. Staff whispered. Aides exchanged quick looks. Security adjusted subtly. And somewhere, in a quieter space, conversation sparked. Did you hear that? She called her a what? Those moments, invisible to the camera, set off chains of reactions that would reverberate in ways no one anticipated. The backstage area became a crucible, a testing ground for strategy, composure, and emotional control. There's a human instinct in situations like this: to protect, to respond, to measure. Meghan's team immediately began assessing damage, thinking in terms of optics, of narrative, of how a single word might be interpreted and amplified. At the same time, Billie's entourage, if you can call it that, seemed unconcerned, or perhaps confident, in the aftermath. That difference in posture, in reaction, is telling. It suggests preparation, intent, or at the very least, awareness of the ripples their actions create. And in those backstage moments, far from the audience's eyes, the story started to branch. Layers upon layers of subtle responses began forming, like tectonic plates shifting slowly beneath a surface that seems still. And then there's the audience itself. Hundreds in the room, millions online. Collective reaction is fascinating. Some cheered. Some clutched their programs. Some whispered, half in disbelief, half in delight. It's a reminder that perception is as important as reality. One word can mean many things depending on who hears it. And that ambiguity, that tension between intent and perception, is what keeps us talking long after the event ends. Because it isn't just what was said, it's how it lands, how it resonates, how it fractures and reframes a carefully curated public image. But here's what makes this incident truly compelling: the subtle contradictions. Billie's remark was casual but calculated. Meghan's response was composed but human. The room reacted predictably but unpredictably. Social media erupted with immediacy, but the depth of the story, what happened behind the cameras, what intentions were at play, remained concealed. Contradiction fuels curiosity, and curiosity drives attention. That's why this night didn't just generate headlines. It became a living, breathing narrative, one that would unfold in ways no one expected. And that's when things began to accelerate. Subtle gestures turned into signals. Expressions that seemed fleeting in the moment became fodder for analysis, debate, and speculation. Staff members, anxious or perhaps just observant, began sharing what they saw in whispers that would later be quoted anonymously. Cameras that once captured polite applause now lingered, almost insistently, on micro-expressions. The story started to fracture, spreading in multiple directions simultaneously: public perception, backstage tension, and the media narrative. Each element feeding the other, each moment amplifying the next. So we're left with a question: how do two people, occupying the same space, with the same audience, generate such different, yet intersecting realities? It's a question about human behavior, about power, about influence. And it's why the rest of the night, and what happened after, cannot be understood merely by watching the stage. The layers, the unseen currents, the undercurrents of emotion, calculation, and reaction, they all matter. But what no one could have anticipated was what happened in the minutes immediately after that exchange. The cameras panned, the applause resumed, speeches continued. But somewhere, behind the stage, decisions were being made, allegiances were shifting, and the next chapter of this story was quietly, almost imperceptibly, starting to unfold. And that chapter would change everything. The room had barely exhaled from that first tension when a new layer of scrutiny began to settle over the event. Eyes that had been casually scanning programs or lingering on familiar faces now sharpened, following every movement of Meghan and Billie like a study in anticipation. The air, once thick with polite applause, felt heavier. It wasn't obvious at first, this shift. Most people might have mistaken it for the natural pause between speeches. But if you were paying attention, you could sense the subtle recalibration. People were measuring, guessing, trying to determine what was scripted and what wasn't. Have you ever noticed how a room can collectively lean forward, just slightly, as if trying to catch a whisper? That's what happened here. Cameras lingered, not because anyone directed them, but because the tension demanded it. A single glance, a half smile, the slight tightening of a jaw. They became the signals everyone subconsciously read. And then, the people closest to the stage started moving differently. Assistants and aides adjusted stances, whispering hurriedly, exchanging quick glances. Their anxiety wasn't for themselves. It was for what might happen next. A ripple effect had begun, and the subtle energy on stage was contagious. Billie, for her part, remained composed. There was a controlled calm in her expression, an almost studied detachment. Not arrogance, not triumph, but precision. She knew how to occupy space, how to command attention without raising her voice. And that's what made the impact so stark. The contrast between her casual assertiveness and Meghan's carefully maintained composure. One word had created an imbalance, a pivot in the room's dynamics, and Billie's demeanor only amplified it. It was a reminder that sometimes, power in a room isn't about volume. It's about timing, delivery, and subtlety.